Chapter 6, How of Mice and Men, last chapter. I'm very excited to finish this. So here's my plan. I'm just going to read the chapter, and then I'm going to make another video where I explain the chapter and kind of the whole story and hit a couple of other major topics, things that I want to discuss. So let's just go in for the ride. As we remember, last chapter, in chapter 5, Lenny was petting Curly's wife's soft hair, and she let him. And then she kind of started to freak out. And he got scared, and he grabbed her and put his hand over her mouth and grabbed her and shook her and said, "Be quiet," and snapped her neck and left her dead in the haystack. And then, of course, Candy came in, and then George came in, and all the guys came in. So they're going to go out now. They're going to hunt down Lenny. The whole point is to try and catch him. Curly says, shoot him in the guts. So Lenny remembered that he's going to run down by the river, down to the brush where George told him at the very beginning. So we're ending chapter 6, right where we started. Page 98. The deep green pool of the Salinas River was still in the late afternoon. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Gabilan Mountains, and the hilltops were rosy in the sun. But by the pool, among the mottled sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of a motionless heron that stood in the shallows. A silent head and beak lanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while its tail waved frantically. A far rush of wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave. The sycamore leaves turned up their silver sides. The brown, dry leaves on the ground scuttled a few feet. And row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. As quickly as it had come, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. Lenny suddenly appeared out of the brush, and he came as silently as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded the air with its wings, jacked itself clear of the water, and flew off down the river. The little snake slid in among the reeds at the pool's side. Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. He knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water. When a little bird skittered over the dry leaves behind him, his head jerked up and strained toward the sound with his eyes and ears until he saw the bird, and then he drooped his head and drank again. When he finished, he sat down on the bank with his side to the pool so that he could watch the trail's entrance. He embraced his knees and laid his chin down on his knees. The light climbed on out the valley, and as it went, the tops of the mountains seemed ablaze with increasing brightness. Lenny said softly, "I didn't forget, you bet, goddamn. Hide in the brush and wait for George." He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "George's gonna give me hell," he said. "George's gonna wish he was alone and not have me bothering him." He turned his head and looked at the bright mountaintops. "I can go right off there and find the cave," he said, and he continued sadly, "I never have no ketchup. But I wouldn't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away. I'll go away." And then from out of Lenny's head there came a little fat old woman. She wore thick bullseye glasses, and she wore a huge gingham apron with pockets, and she was starched and clean. She stood in front of Lenny and put her hands on her hips, and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And when she spoke, it was Lenny's voice. "I told you," she said. "I told you, mind George, because he's such a nice fella and good to you. But you don't never take no care. You do bad things." And Lenny answered her, "I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am.
I tried and tried. I couldn't help it. You never give a thought to George, she went on in Lenny's voice. He been doing nice things for you all the time. When he got a piece of pie, you always got half, or more than half. And if there was any ketchup, why, he'd give it all to you. I know, said Lenny miserably. I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and tried. She interrupted him. All the time you could have had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would have took his pay and raised hell in the whorehouse, and he could have sat in the pool room and played snooker, but he got to take care of you. Lenny groaned with grief. I know, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I'll go right up in the hills, and I'll find a cave, and I'll live there so I won't be no more trouble to George. You just say that, she said sharply. You're always saying that. And you know, son of a bitch and well, you ain't never gonna do it. You'll just stick around and stew the bejesus out of George all the time. Lenny said, I might just well go away. George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now. Aunt Clara was gone. And from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat on its haunches in front of him, and it waggled its ears, and it crinkled its nose at him, and it spoke in Lenny's voice, too. Tend rabbits, it said scornfully. You crazy bastard. You ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbit. You'd forget 'em and let 'em go hungry. That's what you do. And then what would George think? I would not, Lenny said loudly. The hell you wouldn't, said the rabbit. You ain't worth a greased jackpin to ram you into hell. Christ knows George done everything he could to jack you out of the sewer, but it don't do no good. If you think George's gonna let you tend rabbits, you're even crazier than usual. He ain't. He gonna beat hell out of you with a stick. That's what he's gonna do. Now Lenny retorted belligerently. He ain't neither. George wouldn't do nothing like that. I've knew George since I forget when. And he ain't never raised his hand to me with a stick. He's nice to me. He ain't gonna be mean. Well, he's sick of you, said the rabbit. He's gonna beat hell out of you and then go away and leave you. He won't, Lenny cried frantically. He wouldn't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him travels together. But the rabbit repeated softly over and over, He gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. He gonna leave you alone. He gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. Lenny put his hands over his ears. He ain't! I tell you he ain't! And he cried out, George! 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 George came quietly out of the brush, and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's brain. George said quietly, What the hell are you yelling about? Lenny got up on his knees. You ain't gonna leave me, are you, George? I know you ain't. George came stiffly near and sat down beside him. No. I know that, Lenny cried. You ain't that kind. George was silent. Lenny said, George? Yeah. I done another bad thing. It don't make no difference, George said, and he fell silent again. Only the topmost ridges were in the sun now. The shadow in the valley was blue and soft. From the distance came the sound of men shouting to one another. George turned his head and listened to the shouts. Lenny said, George? Yeah? Ain't you gonna give me hell? Give you hell. Sir, like you always done before, like if I didn't have you, I'd take my $50. Jesus Christ, Lenny. You can't remember nothing that happens, but you remember every word I say. Well, ain't you gonna say it? George shook himself. He said woodenly, if I was alone, I could live so easy. His voice was monotonous, had no emphasis. I get a job and not have no mess. He stopped. Go on, said Lenny. And when the end of the month comes, I take my $50, go to a cat house. He stopped again. Lenny looked eagerly at him. Go on, George. Ain't you going to give me no more hell? No, said George. Well, I can go away, said Lenny. I'll go right off in the hills and find a cave if you don't want me. George shook himself again. No, he said, I want you to stay here with me. Lenny said craftily, tell me like you've done before. Tell you what? About the other guys, it's about us. George said, guys like us got no family. They make a little steak and then they blow it in. They ain't got nobody in the world that gives a hoot in hell about them. But not us, Lenny cried happily. Tell about how it is with us. George was quiet for a moment. But not us, he said. Because I got you. And I got you. We got each other. That's what. That gives a hoot in hell about us. Lenny cried in triumph. The little evening breeze blew over the clearing, and the leaves rustled and the wind waves flowed up the green pool. And the shouts of men sounded again, this time much closer than before. George took off his hat. He said shakily, take off your hat, Lenny. The air feels fine. Lenny removed his hat dutifully and laid it on the ground in front of him. The shadow in the valley was bluer, and the evening came fast. On the wind, the sound of crashing in the brush came to them. Lenny said, tell how it's going to be. George had been listening to the distant sounds. For a moment, he was businesslike. Look across the river, Lenny, and I'll tell you so you can almost see it. Lenny turned his head and looked off across the pool and up the darkening slopes of the Gabillons. You're going to get a little place, George began. He reached in his side pocket and brought out Carlson's Luger. He snapped off the safety, and the hand and gun lay on the ground behind Lenny's back. He looked at the back of Lenny's head, at the place where the spine and skull were joined. A man's voice called from up the river, and another man answered. Go on, said Lenny. George raised the gun, and his hand shook. He dropped his gun to the ground again. Go on, said Lenny. How's it gonna be? Gonna get a little place? We'll have a cow, said George. We'll have maybe a pig and chickens. And down the flat, we'll have a little piece of alfalfa. For the rabbits! Lenny shouted. For the rabbits, George repeated. And I get to tend the rabbits. You get to tend the rabbits. Lenny giggled with happiness. and live off the fat of the land. Lenny turned his head. No, Lenny. Look across down there, across the river. Like you can almost see the place. Lenny obeyed him. George looked down at the gun. There were crashing footsteps in the brush now. George turned, looked toward them. Go on, George. When are we going to do it? Gonna do it soon. Me and you. You and me. Everybody's gonna be nice to you. Ain't gonna be no more trouble. Nobody gonna hurt nobody nor steal from you. Lenny said, I thought you was mad at me, George. No, said George. No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I've never been mad and I ain't now. It's a thing I want you to know. The voices came close now. George raised the gun and listened to the voices. Lenny begged, let's do it now. Let's get that place now. Sure. I know. I gotta. We gotta. And George raised the gun and steadied it. And he brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lenny's head. The hand shook violently, but his face set and his hand steadied. He pulled the trigger. The crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again. Lenny jarred and then settled forward to the sand, and he lay without quivering. George shivered and looked at the gun, and then he threw it from him, back up on the bank, near the pile of old ashes. The brush seemed filled with cries and with the sound of running feet. Slim's voice shouted, George! Where you at, George? But George sat stiffly on the bank and looked at his right hand that had thrown the gun away. The group burst into the clearing, and Curly was ahead. He saw Lenny lying on the sand. Got him, by God! He went over and looked down at Lenny, and then he looked back at George. Right in the back of the head, he said softly. Slim came directly to George and sat down beside him, sat very close to him. Never you mind, said Slim. A guy got to sometimes. But Carlson was standing over George. How'd you do it? He asked. I just done it, George said tiredly. Did he have my gun? Yeah, he had your gun. And you got it away from him and you took it and you killed him? Yeah, that's it. George's voice was almost a whisper. He looked steadily at his right hand that had held the gun. Slim twitched George's elbow. Come on, George. Me and you will go in and get a drink. George let himself be helped to his feet. Yeah, a drink. Slim said, You had it, George. I swear you had it. Come on with me. He led George into the entrance of the trail and up toward the highway. Curly and Carlson looked after them, and Carlson said, Now what the hell you suppose eating them two guys? Now's about the time where I usually offer my students some tissues, because, it's heartbreakingly sad. You guys. George had to shoot Lenny, his best friend. I love this story, but it's so sad. I love it because they're such good friends and they've gone through so much together. And it's such a heartbreaking, terrible situation. Why is it heartbreaking and terrible? Because there were no options. Keep in mind, this was the 1930s. Arresting Lenny, 1930s in a rural area. There were policemen, there was the law, but you know what? A lot of places like this, they just handled things themselves. It's not like the police that we have today. And so they formed a posse. And so the possible outcomes, George and Lenny run away. And Candy says, why don't you just let them run away? Well, here's the thing. They ran away in weed. Remember at the very beginning? They ran away in weed, but the girl wasn't actually hurt. That's an important distinction. She wasn't hurt. She was scared. So once that girl calmed down, do you think she continued to fuss about it? No. She probably calmed down and was like, you know what, guys? I overreacted. He grabbed my dress. He scared me, but I'm okay. But this time, Lenny actually killed Curly's wife. There's no undoing that. There's no forgiveness for a dead woman. So Candy says, why don't we just let him run away? That's not going to work. You can't let him run away. The cops are, the posse's going to chase after him. They're not going to give up. Could Lenny live off in the cave? Do you think Lenny could live off in the cave? No. We all know that that's not going to happen. They say, why don't we just take him in and maybe we can lock him up? But Slim says, you know that's no good for Lenny. You know that's not. Lenny, you're not going to lock him up in an insane asylum or in prison. Like, he's going to spend his whole life, his whole mind will be so confused and so scared and so miserable. Okay, so we let Curly get him. What's Curly going to do? Shoot him in the guts and make him feel horrible, horrible pain as he's dying, as he's bleeding out. Curly's going to mock him and yell at him and maybe punch him while he's dying and in pain. And Lenny would be scared. Curly is going to make Lenny regret what he has done. Remember what happened with Candy's dog? Candy's dog was old, no good for himself, couldn't eat, couldn't hardly walk. Candy's dog had reached the end of its useful life. The options were so slim here. So George took Candy's words. Candy said, I should have shot my dog myself. I oughtn't to. I should not have let a stranger shoot my dog. Lenny is not George's dog, but Lenny is George's very best dear friend. George takes care of Lenny, and Lenny needs some serious taking care of right now. Their options are so small, so George takes what little opportunity he has to make the end of Lenny's life as good as it can be. How did Lenny die? Dreaming about the rabbits, dreaming about their ranch, thinking about their hopes, their dreams for the future, thinking about their happy life ever after. Those were the last thoughts in his mind. All right. What do you think is going on with Aunt Clara and the rabbit there? That was kind of weird. What do you think about this as the last line of the story? Oh, it gets me every time. Now, what the hell you suppose eating them two guys? That's the last line of the story? Come on. What do you suppose is going on there? Those two things and much more we shall talk about at a later time, later date, but that's going to finish it up for now. It's a great story. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you guys later.